Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for having me today to speak about climate, the next strategic imperative. My name is Caitlin McDonald. I work for an organization called the Leading Edge Forum, and we work applying research insights to help chief officers address strategic challenges. So we exist at the intersection of academia, industry analysis, and thought leadership to help business leaders challenge conventional assumptions with original, future-focused thinking to accelerate their organization's ever-expanding digital mandate. My name is Caitlin McDonald, and this slide had a much bigger build on it than I thought. My name is Caitlin McDonald, and last year I co-authored a paper titled Zeroing In, Data-Driven Sustainability Strategy for a Climate-Altered World with my colleague Paul Johnston. I'm going to take you through why we believe climate is the next strategic imperative and how that shift might shape the future of your organization. So let's kick off with the evidence. As you can see on your screen here, by the way, I could update this slide for every single day of this week and add a new story about a business committing to zero carbon or a major university divesting its fossil fuel assets, for example. The trajectory is set. We are moving towards a zero carbon economy. The carbon-based economy is drying up. This is what the future is going to look like. It's going to be carbon neutral, and we're moving towards there very rapidly. So what does this mean for businesses? Sustainability strategy will become the new strategic center. We are zeroing in, meaning that we're moving towards a zero carbon economy. I'm going to go ahead and just read this slide out to you because it's really the core thesis of the paper that we wrote last year. Sound data strategy consists of the capture, connection, analysis, and contextualization of data in order to create actionable information that informs decision-making. Organizations that place the development of these capabilities at the forefront of their strategy will reap the benefits as we move into a low carbon world. Sustainability strategy, and particularly decarbonization, is going to take an increasingly central role in driving the economy at large, as well as individual businesses and how they operate. Equally importantly, businesses which don't develop these capabilities will be increasingly at risk. In fact, Mark Carney, who was at the time the governor of the Bank of England, said in 2019 that companies which are not working towards zero carbon emissions will go bankrupt without question. So increasingly, not only is moving towards a carbon neutral position a strategic differentiator for businesses, but also not doing so is becoming a strategic risk, which is a really important thing to know. But one of the things that is really important about this is that as we move towards this decarbonized economy, data becomes increasingly important because we have to attribute all of that carbon somewhere and figure out how we're going to get it out of the atmosphere and reduce our emissions. So what does this all really mean? This means that businesses urgently need to begin their strategic evolution towards zero carbon. Our research shows that there are three phases to this evolution: recognition, preparation, and transformation. Broadly speaking, you could match these three phases to the three scopes of emissions that are standardized within the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, although they're not an exact match. Scope 1 emissions are direct emissions from an organization's operational activity. Scope 2 is indirect emissions from electricity, heating, buildings, that kind of thing. And Scope 3 is where things get really interesting. So these are all the indirect emissions that are in a company's value chain. Things like business travel, transportation of goods, waste disposal, how the products that your business creates get used and disposed of, and so forth. All of these things are, to an extent, normally invisible to a business. It's very difficult to attribute that kind of carbon usage, both upstream and downstream from what you're creating. But we believe that this is going to become increasingly important and that businesses are going to be not only pressured through social means, through the increasing desire for decarbonization in the public, but also through legislation that's coming down the pike to be responsible for this. And ultimately, the reason that this has a bearing on technology is that this requires much better data capture, data processing capabilities, and data analysis to really meet these needs. So let's start with phase 1, recognition. This is really important. Just the recognition the sustainability strategy has a role to play in a business's strategic framework is an increasingly important aspect of what we're talking about here today. So typically in phase 1, there might be a small sustainability team who's usually under the remit of a larger business unit, such as finance or legal. Typically finance, because they are often tasked with gathering the data and managing the evaluation for environmental, social, and governance metrics. You know, when you actually need to get down to the bottom line, that's what the finance team is there for, to evaluate the success of a business, and this includes their ESG goals. So the next phase sees the sustainability strategy team becoming their own unit, taking on a larger role, reporting directly to the board about ESG goals. Their agenda becomes parallel with other business unit metrics of success. And finally, in phase 3, the sustainability unit becomes right at the heart of business strategy. A business isn't only measuring its success through bottom line profitability, but also other measures of success, often in line with the UN Sustainable Development Goals, because those are a kind of standard globally recognized way of evaluating success towards sustainability. These are then used to define and evaluate business success, not only within business operations, but also looking at the upstream and downstream impact throughout a business's entire value chain, as I described earlier. And this is increasingly important, and we can see that this change is starting to take place. So even something, I believe it was last year that the Business Roundtable came out and said it's not only shareholder value, which takes primacy in terms of business goals, but we also need to start thinking about other kinds of stakeholders who we impact. And in particular, we also need to think about not just users or people involved in our business who are directly impacted by what we do. We also need to think about external costs and things that are having impact on people that we may never directly deal with, but that might be quite impactful on them. And so this is something that we need to evaluate as we're assessing the profitability of our business. We also need to think about some of those negative impacts that we're having. And to do that, we need to have standard ways of attributing some of those negative impacts, including carbon. So at the moment, for most businesses, this sophisticated data analysis simply isn't feasible yet. There are some leaders in the space, but increasingly, we believe that businesses will be pressured not only through reputational factors, as I mentioned, but also through actual shifts in policy. And we think that there is a growing global movement to require more effective carbon impact reporting. And you can start to see this trend happening through impacts like the EU's recently announced European Green Deal, which will require better data analysis at the company and industry level to determine whether the decarbonization goals are being met. And there's a huge amount of money, I believe it's 100 billion euros to actually reduce the carbon impact into the economy. And in order to access that money, you need to be able to demonstrate that your business is working in the right way. So let's talk through a couple examples. And you might not typically think of the energy sector as being a leader for decarbonization, but in fact, some energy companies like Denmark's Ørsted were early to recognize that their carbon-based assets were rapidly going to erode into liabilities. As we switch towards that zero carbon economy that I'd mentioned, the longer you hold on to those carbon-producing assets, the less valuable they become because you are behind the curve and the value decreases, right? So Ørsted recognized this even before there were economic incentives like there are now to switch to renewable energy and so forth. Ørsted was pushing ahead with its carbon divestment plan. So the energy industry also has a lot of experience with gathering and analyzing data about carbon usage. And in particular, we think that they could have a lot to offer in terms of helping to understand data at different points in the phases in the value chain, because they're more used to looking at the attribution of where carbon is coming from and going to. So while there are various initiatives in place to try and standardize how to track, evaluate, and create accountability for Scope 3 emissions, we've still got a long way to go. But that doesn't mean that there's nothing that you can do. Even if you're in phase 1, where your business is only starting to recognize the importance of the zero carbon economy, you can still start preparing now for a future where increasing data demands will be put on businesses. And what this really means is learning to recognize the kinds of skills that your business will need in terms of data analysis and processing, learning to recognize the emergent discipline of essentially almost a carbon technical officer. You might think about that as, the emergence of the CTO as a role within a company. We might now have chief carbon officers in companies that are looking after these kinds of things and who need to be very closely aligned with data teams that are feeding the right information into place so that you can actually do the attribution that you need to do. And we think that this is an emergent discipline, but it's one where your business can still get ahead of the curve. So for more information about this, please do read our report, Zeroing In, Data-Driven Sustainability Strategy for a Climate-Altered World. And if you have more questions about this, please don't hesitate to reach out to me with your thoughts. You can find me on Twitter at cmcdphd, or you can find us at www.leadingedgeforum.com. Thank you all so much for your time today.